The flames moved like predators, fast, hungry, and without mercy. Trees didn't just burn, they screamed. The ground hissed with falling embers. Sky turned black at noon, and the air became something you couldn't breathe without tasting sorrow. The animals fled in every direction. Birds, foxes, wallabies, all chasing the edge of safety that kept pulling away like a cruel trick. Every creature ran, except her. She didn't run. She couldn't. Her claws gripped a scorched eucalyptus branch, trembling under her weight. Her back was blistered. Her fur was singed in patches, skin raw and cracking. But she didn't move, not because she didn't want to, but because she wouldn't. Curled against her chest, still wet from birth, was a tiny life barely the size of her paw. A newborn, eyes sealed shut, breathing in shallow gasps, completely unaware that the world it had just entered was on fire. She pressed her body against the trunk, trying to shield her baby from the heat that rolled over them like waves from a furnace. She blinked slowly, painfully. Smoke clung to her lashes. Her lips were cracked. Her heartbeat was fading. But she stayed, because leaving meant leaving him. And in that moment, when even the sky was falling, she made a choice. To stay still in a world that was falling apart. To burn if she had to, but not alone. And then, through the roar of fire and breaking timber, there came something else. The sound of boots on ash, a human voice, a gasp, a sudden shout. The rescuer almost missed her, until the branch shifted ever so slightly, until a faint broken sound rose from the silence, until he saw not just one set of eyes, but two. She wasn't just a survivor, she was a mother, and somehow she was still trying to save what little she had left. She didn't resist when the rescuer lifted her into the blanket. She couldn't. Her body sagged, limp with exhaustion and pain, but even then, her arms curled instinctively around the tiny form clinging to her belly. She hadn't moved in hours, but now as the fire crackled behind them, she stirred, just enough to hold on. The truck reeked of smoke and panic. In the back on a bed of hay, she lay barely breathing. The baby, singed but whole, nuzzled into her chest, eyes still closed, heartbeat faint. The woman tending to them had burns on her own arms, but she didn't flinch. She placed a cool cloth on the mother's head, whispering words no animal could understand. But still, somehow, they reached her. At the wildlife center, they didn't think the mother would make it. She was dehydrated, infected. Her lungs were burned from the inside, but she kept lifting her head just enough to check if the baby was near, just enough to make sure he was still there. And when they tried to separate them, even for treatment, she let out the only sound she had left, a hoarse, hollow cry. So they kept them together, and slowly, painfully, she began to heal. Day by day, she moved a little more, ate a little more, sat up longer. The baby, still nameless, still unsteady, started to open his eyes. First one, then both. And when he looked at her, really looked, something happened. She leaned down gently and touched her nose to his. That's when the vet tech started crying. No one had expected them to survive, but they had. Not because medicine worked, not because the fire stopped, but because in the middle of catastrophe, a mother chose to stay, and someone chose to listen. And that made all the difference. Because once people saw her, really saw her, not as just another statistic in the wake of a wildfire, but as a mother who had chosen pain over escape, they couldn't unsee her. Her story spread through the center like oxygen, igniting something that had long gone quiet in many hearts. Volunteers stayed later just to sit by her pen. The woman who rescued her brought in fresh eucalyptus branches from her own yard. A local artist painted them. Mother and child curled together in the hay and left the portrait by their enclosure. Children wrote letters, taped to the glass. You're brave. You stayed. Thank you for saving your baby. And the baby, whom they finally named Ash, began to grow. He stumbled through the grass of the recovery yard like his legs were made of springs. He nipped playfully at his mother's ears. He reached for the sun with wide eyes and paws that had never known the burn of flames. And she, still tired, still healing, watched him with something deeper than pride. She watched him with peace, because now He had a future she bought with every second she stayed in that tree. And it wasn't just their lives that were changed. Something else had shifted too, something harder to measure. People started asking better questions. They didn't just talk about damage to property or acres lost. They asked how many dens were destroyed, how many mothers didn't make it. They stopped seeing fire as a number and started seeing it as a face, her face, the one that refused to disappear. Her presence became a quiet protest against the idea that suffering in silence was the only way animals endured. She didn't vanish into the statistics. She didn't blend into the background. She remained scarred, yes, but whole. And in doing so, she forced the world to look closer, to listen better, to change, even if only a little. People who had never thought twice about the lives hidden in the trees now carried her photo in their wallets. News stations ran her story under words like resilience, motherhood, and grace. But it was more than that. She wasn't just resilient. She was intentional. She made a choice. She burned so her baby wouldn't have to. Ash grew strong and wild. His fur grew in thick, free of the singe lines that once marked him. He climbed higher, faster. He called out with curiosity instead of fear. And always, always, his mother watched. But not with worry anymore, with wonder. Because in a world that had tried to erase them both, they had not only survived, they had insisted on being seen, on mattering, on leaving something behind that would echo. And echo it did, in classrooms where children now asked why wildfires happen more often, in government meetings where new bills were drafted to protect habitat corridors, in hearts where empathy began to bloom again. Not out of guilt, but out of reverence for what stayed behind and endured. She had been found in a tree, waiting to die. But instead, she became the reason others started to live differently. Because once a single act of stillness rewrote what it meant to be brave, people began rethinking what they once accepted as normal. Firefighters started scanning treetops more carefully during evacuations. Rescue teams left extra time, just in case another mother was waiting. And visitors to the Wildlife Center didn't just take photos, they asked questions, real ones, about habitat loss, about climate, about how to help, not just feel sad. The staff called her Ember, not just because of what she survived, but because of what she sparked. She wasn't loud, she wasn't large, she didn't lead protests or stand on podiums, but she shifted the weight of silence with her breath. And in that breath, she reminded everyone that sometimes, the ones who make the biggest difference are the ones who simply refuse to leave. Ash never strayed far from her in those early weeks. His small steps found courage in her shadow. His voice grew stronger because hers never faltered. And slowly, the world outside their enclosure stopped feeling like a threat and started to feel like home. Not because it had healed entirely, but because someone had stayed long enough to begin the healing. And now, in early mornings just before sunrise, when the fog lifts and the eucalyptus leaves rustle, center workers say you can hear them, Ash and Ember, moving together. Not just surviving, living, because one stayed and one grew, and many changed. Not in sweeping revolutions or headlines that shook the world, but in quiet, persistent ways that echoed louder over time. A farmer who once cleared land for grazing now left a patch of forest untouched, remembering her story. A child who watched her video in school planted eucalyptus in his backyard and named each sapling after a mother he'd never meet. A politician who had never spoken of wildlife protection before now opened every speech with a photo of Ember and Ash, pinned to the inside of his jacket like a silent vow. Change didn't come all at once, but it came. It came in the choice to stop before starting a controlled burn, just to double check. It came in the extra blanket left out in the rescue truck, just in case. It came in the way people looked up at trees now, not just as scenery, but as homes, as sanctuaries, as places where courage might still be clinging to the branches, waiting for someone to notice. Ember didn't know any of this, of course. She just watched her son grow stronger each day, watched him climb higher, wander farther, and always return. His head tilted with affection, his small hand resting on hers as if to say, "I remember what you did." She didn't need the world to thank her, because her thanks came in paw prints beside her own, in the scent of unburned leaves, in the fact that she was still here, whole, witnessed, and never alone again. She had given everything to keep one life safe, and in doing so, she ended up saving more lives than she'd ever know. Because the ripples of one refusal, one decision to stay rooted in pain rather than flee from it, spread further than anyone could trace. A university researcher, moved by her story, pivoted her thesis to study maternal bonds in wildfire-displaced mammals. A filmmaker scrapped his project and spent the next 2 years documenting animal rescue centers across the continent. A mother, grieving her own loss, found solace in Ember's defiance and began volunteering at the sanctuary every Sunday without fail, always bringing apples, always choosing the quietest corner to sit and read aloud to those recovering just like she was. No one told her to, but something in Ember's story had made the unbearable seem shareable. And for Ash, it changed everything. Because he would never know the loneliness of being left behind. He would never have to wonder if someone would come for him. He would grow up in a world that had shifted just enough for his feet to land safely, for his breath to be unhurried, for his days to be more than survival. He would live with memory, not of pain, but of protection, not of absence, but of presence. And in his eyes, bright and curious, every person who visited the center could see something they didn't expect to find in a place built from ash and rescue. Hope, not the cheap kind sold in slogans, but the kind born of fire and held together by choice. The kind that reminds us that staying matters, that watching matters, that believing one life is worth fighting for can shift the course of 1,000 more, and that sometimes the greatest changes come not from those who charge forward, but from those who hold their ground. Those who plant their feet not in anger, but in love so fierce it won't be moved. Those who do not chase attention, but change. Those who stay behind when it's easier to run, when it's safer to forget, when it's more convenient to look away, yet choose presence over comfort and memory over silence. That was Ember, not a hero in the traditional sense. No anthem was written in her name, no statue carved. But she shifted something in the collective pulse of a world too quick to turn the page. Because holding ground in her case meant rewriting a story that had always ended the same way. Loss, abandonment, extinction. She didn't just survive. She insisted that survival wasn't enough, that dignity mattered even in death, that life, wild, maternal, aching life, deserved more than to be counted only after it had been taken. And in doing so, she changed not just her future, or ashes, but the very rules by which hope is passed on, not with power, but with persistence. Because when she stayed behind in that tree, she wasn't just holding ground, she was planting something. Something that would grow beyond her, beyond Ash, beyond the burn line of that fire-scarred forest, into the hands of those who had once forgotten how to feel, into the breath of those who finally learned to listen, into the future of those not yet born, but already protected by a mother who refused to disappear. Because her decision, her stillness in the face of fire, her breath wrapped around another, wasn't just an act of survival. It was a message, etched not in words but in instinct, in the way the earth holds memory long after footsteps fade. Future calves, not yet walking, would find shelter in groves left standing because of her. They'd grow up in silence that wasn't empty, but sacred, carved by the breath of one who stayed. And Ash, he would become the kind of protector she once was, not through force, but through presence. He would lead others gently, without needing to be the loudest in the herd. He'd remember the language of stillness, the way safety sounds like heartbeat and smells like eucalyptus. He'd remember how love once wrapped around him like smoke and became sky. And every time he lifted his trunk to greet a new calf, every time he slowed his steps so the weakest could keep up, the story would repeat itself, not as tragedy, but as testament. Because she had stayed, because she had remembered, because she had mattered. And the world, it remembered her in the most important way. Not as a loss, but as a beginning. The kind of beginning that doesn't shout, but settles deep, into policies rewritten, into hands gentled, into fire lines redrawn not just for safety, but for respect. Ember's breath became a blueprint, subtle but everywhere. in how new sanctuaries were designed with space for mothers and calves to rest undisturbed, in how field officers were trained to listen not just for sound, but for silence that might be holding life, and in how people, ordinary people, started asking different questions. Not just, what can we do, but what must we stop doing? Not just, how can we help, but why didn't we before? Ember's story wasn't told with grand speeches or viral headlines. It was told when a ranger paused before clearing a fallen branch, when a child drew her in crayon and said, "She looks like she's thinking," when a woman who had never spoken at meetings stood up and said, "We forgot her once, we won't again." The beginning was slow, but it was real. It moved in footsteps beside the calves she made space for. It echoed in the hush that fell when visitors reached her memorial and just stood. Quiet, still, different. And if you ask the workers at the sanctuary today, they'll tell you she never really left. They'll point to the grove where the eucalyptus trees lean just slightly, as if bowing. They'll tell you that when the fog lifts and the sun hits the ground just right, it almost feels like she's there, watching, not to be remembered, but to remind that staying can change everything, that breathing is a kind of protest, that loving, even once, can last forever. Because true love, the kind not born from convenience or ownership, but from instinct and sacrifice, has a way of carving itself into the world, quietly, without asking for recognition, without expecting return. It lingers in the way a calf leans into its mother's side, long after it no longer needs her milk, in the paths worn into the dirt by elephants who walk not to escape, but to remember. In the pause of every rescuer who hesitates before assuming a story has ended. Ember's love was not loud. It didn't roar or rage or shake the earth, but it rooted itself in soil, scorched by loss, and grew something sacred. And every life that crossed her path carried a piece of that forward. Ash did. So did the keepers who watched her raise him. So did the visitors who left not just moved, but changed. Even the land remembered. Green returning to ash, wildflowers blooming where the fire once burned hottest, as if nature itself was reaching back with gentle hands to hold what Ember had left behind. Not her body, but her choice, her presence, her refusal to vanish. Because when love is given freely, even once, it does not disappear. It becomes a story whispered in winds, passed down through generations, not in words, but in ways of being. It becomes protection. It becomes protest. It becomes proof. Proof that someone stayed, that someone cared, that someone, somewhere, believed that one small act of love was enough. Enough to shift the outcome, not just for Ash, not just for Ember, but for every life quietly teetering on the edge of being forgotten. Enough to remind a world too used to moving on that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is to stay. Enough to change the way a child sees animals, not as exhibits or entertainment, but as stories breathing beside our own. Enough to nudge a policymaker to vote differently. Enough to make one person whisper to another, "I didn't know, but now I do." Because sometimes enough doesn't look like a miracle. It looks like a mother who refused to leave her calf, a breath that kept coming when everything else had stopped, a life that could have ended quietly, but didn't. And maybe that's the only real miracle we ever need. That somewhere in the darkest hour, love showed up, not to erase the pain, not to undo the loss, but to witness it, to hold it, to say, "You matter still." And in that act, so simple, so unremarkable at first glance, something irreversible began. A shift, a seed, a spark. And as that spark caught wind and found breath in others, it grew into something no fire could destroy. Not a rescue, not a sanctuary, but a memory that walks, a memory that chooses again and again to stay, to protect, to love, even when no one is watching, even when the world forgets, even when it hurts. Because one time, she did, and it was enough. And now, long after the smoke has faded and the cameras have gone, Ash still walks the path his mother carved, not in her shadow, but with her strength. He moves gently, but with purpose. He pauses by the same grove where she once stood guard, trunk raised as if to feel the echo of her breath in the wind. And those who see him, truly see him don't ask what happened anymore. They ask what they can do, because her legacy wasn't made of monuments or names engraved in stone. It was made of lives continued, of pain not repeated, of silence broken. And the sanctuary, now quiet under a canopy of eucalyptus trees, holds more than just animals. It holds memory. It holds presence. It holds a promise that no mother will ever be left behind again, that no breath will go unnoticed, that every act of staying, of witnessing, can become the reason someone else gets to begin. Ember's story did not end in fire. It became the soil from which new lives would rise. If this story moved you, even for a moment, don't let it end here. Speak up, share her name, learn where your choices lead. Because behind every product, every silence, every "I didn't know," there might be another ember waiting to be seen. Love once, stay once, act once, and it might just be enough to change everything.